Emma never imagined a chance encounter on the streets would change her life forever. When billionaire Ethan Hayes offers her a marriage contract, it's just a business deal until forbidden emotions ignite between them. As passion and fear collide, will Ethan risk everything for love, or will his past destroy them both? The homeless girl with a broken past London's night was cold, unforgiving. The streets were empty except for the occasional car passing by, their headlights cutting through the misty air. Amidst the darkness, in a shadowed alleyway, a young woman sat curled against the damp brick wall, hugging herself for warmth. Emma Clark. Once she had a future. Once she had dreams. But tonight, all she had was the tattered coat wrapped tightly around her trembling frame. Her fingers, raw from the cold, clutched at the thin fabric as she exhaled a shaky breath, watching it dissolve into the icy air. How did it come to this? She asked herself for the thousandth time. A bitter smile played on her lips as memories surged forward, uninvited and painful. Emma's past, a love that turned to betrayal. A few years ago, Emma's life had been normal. No, it had been beautiful. She had been a promising medical student, engaged to the love of her life, Lucas Carter. He had been everything she thought she wanted, charming, intelligent, and deeply affectionate. Or so she believed. But betrayal is never loud. It's a whisper in the dark, a knife slipping between your ribs when you least expect it. She had come home one evening, her heart full of excitement, only to find Lucas in her apartment, with Claire, her best friend. Emma, Claire had said, laughing softly. Did you really think Lucas loved you? Emma had felt her world tilt, her breath stolen from her lungs. Lucas had smirked, cruel and unapologetic. You were just convenient, Emma. Smart, rich, and trusting. You made it too easy. The truth had unraveled like a nightmare. Lucas had used her name to take out massive loans. Claire had helped forge the documents, and now they were leaving her with nothing. By the time she realized what had happened, it was too late. Her reputation was in ruins. The people she trusted had painted her as a liar, a fraud, a woman who had lost everything because of her own stupidity. She was expelled from university. Her accounts were drained. Her home was taken. She was left with nothing but the bitter taste of betrayal and the cruel reality of the streets. The billionaire who trusts no one across the city, in the backseat of a sleek black Rolls-Royce, Ethan Hayes sat with his fingers resting against his temple, his expression unreadable. The glow from his phone screen illuminated his face as he skimmed through reports, barely paying attention to the passing city lights. Sir, his assistant, Daniel, spoke hesitantly. There's a small issue with the merger. Ethan didn't look up, then fix it. Daniel hesitated. The CEO of the British firm wants assurance that you have a stable personal life. Ethan's fingers stilled, meaning Daniel cleared his throat, meaning they only want to partner with businessmen who have strong family values. They're looking for someone married, or at least in a serious relationship. A dry, humorless chuckle escaped Ethan's lips. So I need a wife now. Daniel offered a weak smile. Temporarily, sir. Ethan exhaled through his nose, closing his eyes briefly. He had no time for relationships, no patience for love. He had learned from an early age that love was just another business transaction. His parents' marriage had been proof of that, a cold, calculated arrangement that ended in mutual destruction. Love was a liability, and Ethan Hayes didn't do liabilities. The fateful night, as Ethan's car moved through a deserted alleyway, a sudden movement in the shadows caught the driver's attention. Sir, there's someone on the street. Ethan barely looked up. Keep driving. But the driver hesitated. I think she's unconscious. Annoyance flickered across Ethan's face as he finally turned his gaze outside. There, slumped against the brick wall, was a woman barefoot, wrapped in an old coat, her long tangled hair falling over her pale face. For a moment, he considered ignoring it. She wasn't his problem, but then he saw her eyes. Even from a distance, they held something that made him pause. Not just desperation, but defiance. A fire that refused to die. Ethan exhaled sharply and spoke dismissively. "Give her some money." His driver stepped out, pulling out a crisp £50 note, offering it to her. But the woman, Emma, lifted her chin and shook her head. "I don't take charity." Her voice was hoarse but firm. That made Ethan pause. His driver frowned. "Miss, you need help. Not your kind of help." She cut him off, her gaze unwavering. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his interest piqued. He had seen countless people beg, plead, lie for money. But this woman refused it, even when she clearly had nothing. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Intrigue, but before he could think further, Emma suddenly swayed. Ethan barely had time to react. Before she collapsed, instinct kicked in. Before he even realized what he was doing, he stepped out and caught her in his arms. Her body was light, far too light, as if she hadn't eaten in days. He felt the icy cold of her skin, through his suit, her breath faint against his chest. For the first time in years, something unfamiliar stirred within him, concern. His grip on her tightened for a brief second as he looked down at her face, delicate features, full lips, long lashes that trembled slightly as she struggled to stay conscious. His jaw clenched. He should leave her. He should walk away, but he didn't. Instead, he carried her into his car. He didn't know why, but something told him this woman was about to change everything. A strange warmth in the cold. The first thing Emma felt was warmth. A strange, unfamiliar warmth that wrapped around her like a cocoon, so different from the freezing streets she had called home for months. Her body felt heavy, exhausted, yet for the first time in a long while, safe. Her fingers brushed against something impossibly soft. Silk. Her eyes fluttered open, and what she saw made her breath hitch. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the high ceiling, its golden light casting a soft glow across the elegant room. The walls were painted in rich, muted tones, adorned with modern artwork that looked far too expensive for her to even dream of touching. The air smelled of something clean, expensive, a blend of sandalwood and something distinctly masculine. It was then that she realized she wasn't outside, she was in a bed, a real warm bed, with satin sheets that felt like heaven against her skin. Panic struck, she bolted upright, her breath coming fast. Where was she? What happened? The last thing she remembered was cold, sitting in the alleyway, the billionaire's car stopping, refusing his money, and then, her heart pounded. The man. And as if summoned by her thoughts, a deep, composed voice cut through the silence. "You're awake." Emma turned sharply, only to find him standing near the large window, his hands in his pockets, watching her with an unreadable expression. Ethan Hayes, tall, imposing, dangerous in a way that wasn't physical, but something deeper. His dark eyes flickered with quiet curiosity as he observed her, like a man who had just made an investment and was assessing its worth. Emma swallowed hard. What the hell had she gotten herself into? A battle of wills. Emma's survival instincts kicked in. She scrambled back, gripping the sheets around her, as if they were armor. "Where am I?" Ethan raised a brow, his expression calm. "My house." Her heart pounded. "Why?" A slight smirk tugged at his lips. "Because you passed out on the street. I wasn't in the mood to let someone freeze to death right in front of my car." She glared at him. "So you kidnapped me." That made him chuckle, a low, rich sound that irritated her, for some reason. "Hardly. If I had kidnapped you, you wouldn't be waking up in a guest room with your clothes still on." Heat flared in Emma's cheeks. Arrogant bastard. She looked down at herself, still in her old coat and jeans, though someone had placed a thick blanket over her. She clenched her jaw. "I didn't ask for your help." Ethan tilted his head, amusement flickering in his gaze. "No, you didn't, but I gave it anyway, and now you owe me." Her breath hitched. Owe him? Her defenses shot up immediately. She had been through enough betrayals to know that help always came with a price. "I don't owe you anything," she said, through gritted teeth. Ethan took a slow step closer. "I disagree." The air between them thickened, charged with something unspoken. His presence was suffocating, powerful, dominant, and utterly in control. Emma refused to let herself be intimidated. She lifted her chin. "Then let me go." Ethan studied her, for a long moment, then sighed, shaking his head. "You're stubborn. That might come in handy." Her brows furrowed. "What the hell does that mean?" He ignored her question, and walked over to the small table beside the bed, picking up a steaming cup of coffee. He held it out to her. "Drink." Emma eyed the cup suspiciously. "What is it?" Ethan rolled his eyes. "It's coffee, not poison. Though if I wanted to kill you, I would have let the cold do it." Charming. Her body ached, her head throbbed, and she knew she needed the warmth. She reluctantly took the cup, but didn't drink. Ethan smirked. "You think it's poisoned, don't you?" She met his gaze defiantly. "I don't trust you." Something flickered in his expression. Something brief, unreadable. "Good. Trust is earned, not given." For a moment silence settled between them, charged and electric, and then Ethan spoke again. "I have a proposal. An offer she can't refuse." Emma stiffened. "What kind of proposal?" Ethan exhaled, moving to sit on the armchair across from her. "You need a way out of whatever hell you're living in." Her jaw tightened. "And what do you get?" He met her eyes, completely unreadable. "A wife." The room turned eerily silent. Emma blinked. "Excuse me." Ethan leaned back in his chair, as if discussing business, not marriage. "I need to finalize a deal. The people I'm working with only want to partner with family men. Men with stability, trust and strong values." His lips curled slightly. "Obviously I don't fit the description." Emma's breath caught. He wanted her to pretend to be his wife. It was insane. Absolutely insane. She scoffed. "And you think I'm the perfect candidate?" Ethan shrugged. "You have no ties, no history that can be traced. You're smart, stubborn, and desperate enough to consider it." Emma glared at him. "You're unbelievable." He smirked. "I know." She looked away, her mind racing. This was ridiculous. And yet, what choice did she have? If she left, she would go back to the streets, back to hunger, back to the cold. But if she stayed, she turned back to Ethan, her heart pounding. "What's in it for me?" He leaned forward, his gaze locking onto hers. "A new life, a promise, a temptation, a deal with the devil." And Emma knew she was about to make the most dangerous decision of her life. The contract that changed everything. Emma's pulse hammered in her ears as she stared at Ethan, her fingers tightening around the warm coffee cup in her hands. A marriage. The word lingered between them, thick with unspoken meaning. This man, this cold, unreadable billionaire, wanted her to pretend to be his wife. Emma let out a sharp, disbelieving laugh. "You're out of your mind." Ethan smirked, leaning back against his chair, perfectly composed. "Perhaps, but my offer stands." Emma's head spun. This was crazy, completely, utterly insane. And yet, she thought about the alternative, returning to the streets, battling hunger, fighting off dangers lurking in the dark alleys of London. Would she really survive another winter? Her pride screamed at her to walk away. But her survival instincts, they whispered a different story. Ethan tilted his head slightly, watching her. "What's holding you back?" Emma exhaled sharply. "You're asking me to sign my life away." "No," Ethan corrected. "I'm offering you a way out." She clenched her jaw. "For what?" "So you can parade me around like some trophy." A flicker of amusement crossed his face. "Not a trophy, a necessity." Emma scoffed. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Ethan said, his voice smooth, deliberate. "You're strong, you're smart, and you have nothing to lose." Her breath hitched. Nothing to lose. It was true. She had already lost everything. Her fingers trembled as she placed the coffee cup down. "What are the terms?" Ethan's lips curled slightly. She was considering it, and he knew he had already won. The conditions of a loveless marriage. Minutes later, Ethan slid a sleek black folder across the glass table between them. Emma hesitated before opening it. Inside was a contract, its contents detailed and precise, just like the man sitting across from her. Her eyes skimmed over the words: 6-month marriage contract, no emotional involvement, a public relationship, private distance, no intimacy, unless mutually agreed upon. In return, financial stability, housing, and a fresh start. Emma swallowed hard. It felt like a deal with the devil. Ethan watched her carefully. Everything is straightforward. You pretend to be my wife. We attend events together. And after 6 months, we part ways. No strings attached. She exhaled, gripping the pages tighter. And if I refuse? Ethan didn't even blink. Then you walk out that door and take your chances. The words were cold, indifferent, but something flickered in his dark eyes. A challenge. Emma set the contract down and met his gaze. What if I break the rules? Ethan smirked, but his voice remained firm. Then the deal is off, and so is your safety net. Her stomach twisted. She wasn't naive. This wasn't kindness. This was business. She had spent her life trusting the wrong people. She had let love destroy her once. This time, she wouldn't be a fool. Emma inhaled deeply, her fingers curling around the pen, and then she signed. Ethan's lips barely moved, but there was something like satisfaction in his eyes. She belonged to him now. The first test. The moment Emma signed her name, Ethan rose from his seat. We leave in 1 hour. She blinked. What? Ethan buttoned his crisp suit jacket, his movements smooth and controlled. We have an event tonight. You're my wife now. Time to act like it. Emma's stomach twisted. She wasn't ready for this. I don't have anything to wear, she said quickly. Ethan didn't even hesitate. He pulled out his phone, sent a quick text, and within seconds, a woman entered the room. A poised, elegant stylist, carrying a selection of dresses. Emma stiffened. You had this planned. Ethan smirked. I don't leave things to chance. The stylist, a middle-aged woman, with sharp eyes, approached Emma with a knowing smile. Let's get you ready, Mrs. Hayes. Emma flinched at the title. Mrs. Hayes. She wasn't ready for this. And yet, an hour later, as she stood before the full-length mirror, dressed in an elegant black gown that hugged her curves perfectly, she barely recognized herself. Her hair was styled in soft waves, her makeup was subtle yet striking, and for the first time in years, she didn't look like a woman who had lost everything. She looked powerful. Ethan entered the room, adjusting the cufflinks on his expensive suit. When his gaze landed on her, he froze. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in his expression, a silent appreciation, a hesitation. But then just as quickly, he masked it. You'll do. Emma rolled her eyes. Charming. Ethan smirked, stepping closer. He reached for her wrist, his touch unexpectedly warm against her skin. One last thing. She inhaled sharply, as he pulled out a diamond ring, and with deliberate ease, slipped it onto her finger. The moment it clicked into place, a strange sensation spread through her chest. Something deep, something unfamiliar. Ethan's voice was low, steady. From now on we play the part. Emma swallowed, her heart pounding. This was it. No turning back. She lifted her chin, meeting his gaze. Then let's give them a show. Ethan's smirk deepened. That's my girl. And just like that, they stepped out into a world that would never see the truth behind the perfect lie. A world she didn't belong to. Emma had never felt more out of place in her life. The grand ballroom was bathed in golden light, the crystal chandeliers sparkling like diamonds overhead. Elegant guests in designer gowns and tailored suits mingled, their laughter light, their conversations polished. The scent of expensive perfume and champagne filled the air, and the soft hum of a live orchestra played in the background. It was breathtaking and utterly suffocating. Emma's fingers curled around the chilled champagne glass in her hand, her knuckles turning white. She didn't belong here. She could feel the weight of their gazes, whispers of curiosity, judgment and intrigue dancing through the air. As they took her in. Who is she? Where did she come from? Why have we never seen her before? She forced herself to remain still, her shoulders squared, her chin lifted. Beside her, Ethan exuded his usual calm dominance, his posture relaxed yet commanding, as if the entire room belonged to him. And maybe it did. Ethan Hayes, the untouchable billionaire, the cold-hearted king of high society. And now, standing at his side, was her, Emma, the girl who used to sleep in the streets, just days ago. The irony wasn't lost on her. A hand suddenly rested on the small of her back, a firm, reassuring presence. She flinched slightly, turning her head to find Ethan's face impossibly close. His voice was smooth, quiet. "Breathe, sweetheart. You look like you're about to bolt." Emma forced out a shaky breath. "I don't belong here." Ethan's lips curled slightly. "You're my wife now." "That means you do, wife." The word sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. Before she could reply, a couple approached them, a man in his mid-50s, and a beautiful woman draped in diamonds. Their smiles were practiced, their curiosity sharp. "Ethan, my boy." The man extended a hand, shaking Ethan's firmly before turning to Emma. "And this must be the mysterious wife we've all been dying to meet." Emma swallowed. "Here we go." Ethan's grip on her waist tightened slightly, his touch grounding. His voice was deep, confident. "Yes, meet Emma, my wife." Emma forced a polite smile. "It's lovely to meet you." The woman's eyes gleamed with curiosity. "What a surprise, Ethan. You've kept her hidden for so long. How did you two meet?" Emma's heart pounded. This was it, the first test. She hesitated for half a second, but Ethan was quicker. His voice softened just enough to sound genuine. "It was unexpected. I wasn't looking for love." But then, he turned to her, his eyes dark, intense. "I saw her, and everything changed." The couple melted. The woman sighed dreamily. "How romantic." Emma nearly choked. "Romantic." Ethan's thumb brushed against her waist, a silent warning to play along. So she did. Turning to him, she forced herself to look into his unreadable gaze. "Yes, I suppose it was fate." Ethan smirked subtly. "It definitely wasn't planned." The couple laughed, clearly charmed, before moving on to another conversation. Emma exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly. She had survived. But the night was far from over. The dance that changed everything. As the evening continued, Emma played her role perfectly. She smiled when expected, laughed at the right moments, let Ethan guide her through introductions, his hand never leaving her lower back, a silent reminder that she wasn't alone in this lie. But nothing prepared her for what came next. The orchestra's melody shifted, a soft enchanting waltz filling the room. And then Ethan turned to her, his dark eyes locked onto hers, unreadable. "Dance with me." Emma's breath caught. "What?" His smirk was subtle, but there was something dangerous about it. "You're my wife, remember, people expect it." Her heart pounded. This wasn't part of the deal. But before she could refuse, Ethan took her hand, leading her onto the ballroom floor. A dozen eyes followed them. The whispers grew louder. "The mysterious Mrs. Hayes." And then he pulled her close. Emma inhaled sharply, as his hand settled on her waist, his grip firm, possessive. His scent surrounded her, sandalwood spice, and something undeniably intoxicating. "Relax," Ethan murmured. "You're too stiff." She shot him a glare. "Forgive me for not being an expert at fake marriages and ballroom dancing." He chuckled, low and rich. "Just follow my lead." And then they moved. The world blurred around them, as Ethan guided her effortlessly, his movements smooth, controlled. For the first time that night, Emma wasn't thinking about the stares, the whispers, or the weight of this arrangement. She was only aware of him, the way his fingers pressed against her waist, the way his breath fanned against her skin, as he leaned in slightly, the way his eyes darkened when their gazes locked. Something dangerous flickering in their depths, something that sent heat rushing through her veins. And suddenly, it didn't feel like pretending. Emma's pulse quickened. This was wrong.
This was just a deal. But then Ethan's grip tightened, and he pulled her even closer, so close their breaths mingled, their bodies barely separated. Her heart stopped, and in that moment, the world vanished. It was just them, and she wasn't sure if she was still playing a role, or if she was starting to fall into something dangerous, something real. The question that changed everything. The dance ended, applause filled the ballroom, but Emma barely heard it. Her hands were trembling, her breath was uneven. Ethan released her slowly, his expression unreadable, but there was something different in his eyes, something that hadn't been there before. Emma swallowed hard. We should go. Ethan hesitated for just a second, a flicker of uncertainty, of hesitation, and then he nodded. But as he led her toward the exit, a voice stopped them. Ethan, they both turned, only for Emma's blood to run cold. A woman stood there, stunning in a blood-red gown, her lips curled into a knowing smile. But it wasn't her beauty that made Emma's stomach twist. It was the way Ethan's entire body tensed, the way his expression hardened into something unreadable. And then the woman's gaze slid to Emma, her smirk deepening. So you're the new Mrs. Hayes. Emma's heart pounded. She had no idea who this woman was. But judging by Ethan's reaction, she wasn't just anyone. And Emma had a feeling this night was far from over. A name that shattered the moment. Emma's heart pounded as she took in the woman before her, tall, breathtaking, dressed in a blood-red gown that clung to her figure, radiating an effortless confidence that made Emma's stomach twist. But it wasn't just her beauty that made the air turn thick with tension. It was the way Ethan reacted. His entire body had gone rigid. His fingers, which had been lightly resting against Emma's waist, had turned to stone. His jaw clenched, his eyes darkened, and then the woman smirked. Still so quiet, Ethan. Her voice was smooth, teasing, as if she enjoyed the effect she had on him. Ethan exhaled sharply, his tone colder than Emma had ever heard it. What are you doing here, Isabella? Isabella. The name sent a ripple through the air. Even without knowing the details, Emma understood one thing. This woman was important, and worse, she was someone from his past. Isabella's smirk deepened as she crossed her arms, her eyes flickering toward Emma, with a glint of curiosity. I could ask you the same thing, but I suppose I don't have to. She tilted her head, her gaze trailing to Emma's ring. Married, that's new. Emma felt like she was standing on a battlefield, with no armor. Her instincts screamed at her to step back, but then Ethan tightened his grip on her waist. Protective, possessive, a silent message. Emma squared her shoulders. If this was a game, she wouldn't lose. She forced a smile, extending her hand. Yes, we're married. I'm Emma. Isabella arched her brow, staring at Emma's outstretched hand for a moment, before finally shaking it. Her touch light but cool, charming. Her lips curled, though I must admit, I'm surprised. Ethan's voice was sharp. Isabella. She ignored him, keeping her gaze locked on Emma. You must be special, if you managed to make Ethan settle down. After all, he was never the type for commitment. Emma's breath hitched. Was she testing her, trying to break the illusion? Emma glanced up at Ethan, searching his face for any sign of emotion. But he was unreadable, cold, detached, just like he had been when they first met. But his fingers curled slightly against her waist, just enough for her to notice. It was a silent reminder. We're in this together. Emma turned back to Isabella, her expression calm. Some things change. Isabella let out a soft chuckle, almost as if she was amused. And then she leaned in slightly. Let's hope you're ready for him, sweetheart. Emma's pulse stuttered. The words weren't a threat, they were a warning. And before Emma could respond, Isabella stepped back, her eyes flickering with something unreadable. She turned to Ethan one last time, her smirk lingering. It was nice seeing you again, darling. And with that, she walked away, disappearing into the crowd. But the damage was already done. Emma turned to Ethan, her voice barely above a whisper. Who was she? Ethan remained silent for a long moment, his eyes locked on where Isabella had vanished. And then he exhaled, looking at Emma with something close to regret. Someone I should have never trusted. The silent ride home. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Emma barely remembered the conversations, the polite smiles, or the whispered speculation about her and Ethan's sudden marriage. Her mind was spinning, replaying that brief yet charged encounter with Isabel. The tension, the unspoken history, the way Ethan had shut down. The moment he saw her, who was she to him? A past lover, a mistake. And why did it feel like Isabella's warning had been more than just casual words? By the time they reached the car, the weight of the night was crushing her. Ethan slid into the seat beside her, his face unreadable, as the driver started the engine. The silence stretched between them, thick, suffocating.
Ethan.
Emma clenched her fists. Are you going to ignore what happened back there? Ethan exhaled, but didn't look at her. Drop it, Emma. Frustration flared in her chest. Drop it, Ethan. Who was she? His jaw tightened, a pause. And then she was my fiancée. Emma's breath caught. Her heart stopped. She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper.
Ethan.
Finally looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. We were engaged, a long time ago. The air in the car felt heavy. Emma wasn't sure what she had expected, but not this, not a former fiancé, not a past that was clearly unfinished. What happened? She asked softly. Ethan's lips pressed into a thin line. His knuckles were white against his lap. For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer, but then his voice dropped, quieter than she had ever heard it before.
She betrayed me.
Emma's chest tightened.
Oh.
Ethan let out a humorless chuckle. She was only with me for my money, for the power. The moment she had what she wanted, she left. Emma swallowed hard. The coldness in his voice, the quiet bitterness. It wasn't just anger. It was pain, a kind of pain that didn't just disappear. And suddenly, it all made sense. Why Ethan was so closed off. Why he refused to believe in love. Why he had married her, a stranger, instead of risking real emotions again. Emma's chest ached. But before she could say anything, Ethan turned to her, his expression hardening. That's why I don't trust people. And that's why this, he gestured between them, is just a contract, nothing more. The words were sharp, final. But for the first time since meeting him, Emma wasn't sure if he was convincing her, or himself, and that terrified her. The storm between them, the ride back to Ethan's penthouse was suffocating. Emma sat stiffly beside him, her hands clenched in her lap, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. She should have been relieved. This was a contract, nothing more. She had no right to feel anything. And yet her chest ached. She stole a glance at Ethan. He sat perfectly still, his face unreadable, his hands loosely clasped. But there was tension in his posture, a darkness in his eyes that refused to fade. He wasn't just cold, he was haunted. Emma swallowed hard. Do you still love her?
Ethan's jaw ticked. A pause. And then, no. But his voice lacked conviction. Emma turned to face him fully. Then why does she still get to you? Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. You wouldn't understand, wouldn't I? Emma bit her lip. She understood betrayal better than anyone. The kind that shattered trust, that made you afraid to feel again. She should just let it go. But for some reason, she couldn't. You can talk to me. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Ethan let out a humorless chuckle. We aren't friends, Emma. You don't have to act like you care. The words stung more than they should have. Emma inhaled sharply, turning her gaze away. Right, they weren't real. This wasn't real. But then, why did it hurt? The moment that changed everything, by the time they reached the penthouse, the silence between them was thick with unspoken words. Ethan loosened his tie the moment they stepped inside, heading straight for the bar. He poured himself a drink, downing it in one gulp before pouring another. Emma hesitated near the door, watching him. The Ethan she had seen tonight wasn't the same arrogant billionaire she had first met. This version of him was guarded, wounded, alone, and against all logic. she wanted to reach for him. But before she could say anything, Ethan spoke. "Why does it matter to you?" Emma frowned. "What?" He turned, his dark eyes locking onto hers. "Why do you care so much about my past?" Emma swallowed. "I don't know." It was the truth. But it wasn't enough for Ethan. He set his glass down, stalking toward her, his gaze unreadable. "You don't know." Emma's breath hitched as he stopped mere inches away. The air between them shifted, thick, charged. She could feel his warmth, the scent of whiskey, and something undeniably him filling her senses. Her pulse quickened. She should step back. She should break the moment. But she couldn't move. Ethan's gaze dropped to her lips for just a second before flicking back up. "I don't believe you." Emma swallowed hard. "Believe what you want." Ethan exhaled, his voice dropping lower. "You shouldn't care, Emma. This was supposed to be simple." Emma's heart pounded. Was it still simple? Because standing this close to him, feeling the heat between them, the walls she had carefully built were starting to crack. And then Ethan did something she never expected. He reached up, his fingers brushing against her cheek, lingering for just a second too long. Emma shivered. "Ethan." His thumb traced the edge of her jaw. "I shouldn't want you." Emma's breath caught. Want. Her entire body tensed. Was this still a game, or were the lines blurring? But before she could say anything, Ethan's hand dropped, the moment shattered. His expression turned cold again, as if the vulnerability had never existed. "Get some sleep, Emma. We both need it." And with that, he walked away, leaving Emma standing there, her heart racing, her mind in chaos. Because for the first time since this marriage started, she wasn't sure she could keep pretending. The breaking point sleep was impossible. Emma tossed and turned, her mind refusing to let go of the night's events. The way Ethan had looked at her, the way he had touched her, the way his walls had almost come down, and then he had shut her out again. Emma sat up with a frustrated sigh. This wasn't what she had agreed to. This wasn't supposed to feel real. She needed air. Slipping out of bed, she wrapped a shawl around herself and stepped onto the penthouse balcony. The city stretched below, glittering with endless lights, but Emma barely noticed. All she could think about was Ethan, and just when she thought she was alone, she heard footsteps. She turned just in time to see him stepping outside, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the top, his sleeves rolled up. Emma's breath caught. Even at this hour, he looked effortlessly dangerous. Ethan leaned against the railing, his gaze unreadable. "Can't sleep." Emma exhaled. "Neither can you." A ghost of a smile flickered across his lips. "Touché." For a moment neither of them spoke. The tension was back, thick and unrelenting. And then Ethan turned to her. His voice was quiet, almost hesitant. "I was going to marry her, you know." Emma's breath stilled. He was opening up. She nodded slowly, waiting. Ethan exhaled, his gaze distant. "I thought she loved me, but all she loved was the idea of being Mrs. Ethan Hayes." His lips curled in bitterness. She left the moment she got what she wanted. Emma's chest tightened. She had always seen Ethan as invincible, untouchable. But in this moment, he wasn't a billionaire. He wasn't her cold, calculating husband. He was just a man who had been broken. And against all logic, she wanted to heal him. Emma hesitated, then slowly reached out, covering his hand with hers. Ethan tensed slightly, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he looked at her, really looked at her, and just like that, something shifted. The air crackled with something deeper, something raw. Neither of them spoke, but in that moment, in the quiet of the night, with only the city as their witness, everything changed. A night of unspoken confessions. The silence between them stretched long into the night. Emma's hand still rested over Ethan's, her warmth seeping into his skin, anchoring him in a way he hadn't expected. He could have pulled away. He should have, but he didn't. Instead, he let her touch linger, his pulse thrumming against his better judgment. Emma's voice was barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Ethan's gaze snapped to hers, something flickering in his dark eyes. For what? She swallowed, her fingers unconsciously tightening around his. For whatever she did to you, for making you believe love is a lie. Ethan's jaw tensed. His first instinct was to scoff, to dismiss her words as meaningless. But something about the way she looked at him, soft, open, unguarded, made it impossible to lie. He exhaled heavily, dragging a hand through his hair. It doesn't matter anymore. Emma tilted her head, searching his face. It does. You wouldn't have reacted the way you did if it didn't. Ethan clenched his jaw, looking away. She made me believe I was incapable of being loved, that I was only worth what I could provide. Emma's heart twisted. For all his arrogance, his untouchable demeanor, Ethan Hayes was just a man who had been deeply wounded. She hesitated for only a second before whispering. She was wrong. Ethan stilled, his gaze snapped back to hers, searching, questioning. Don't do that, Emma. Her brows furrowed. Do what? He let out a humorless chuckle. Say things like that. Like you mean them. Emma's breath hitched. What if I do? The air between them turned thick, charged with something neither of them wanted to name. And then Ethan moved, slowly, hesitantly. His hand reached up, brushing against her cheek, his fingers tracing the delicate curve of her jaw. Emma's breath shuddered. She knew she should pull away, remind him that this was a contract, a lie, a game, but her body refused to listen. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her eyes fluttering shut for a brief moment, memorizing the feeling of him. Ethan inhaled sharply, his thumb brushing lightly over her lips. Emma, his voice was raw, torn, a silent plea. Emma's heart pounded. Tell me to stop. Ethan's fingers curled slightly against her skin, his jaw clenched, and then he did the one thing she never expected. He let go. Ethan stepped back, his expression unreadable, his breathing unsteady. Go to bed, Emma. His voice was strained, filled with unspoken emotions. Before we do something we can't take back. Emma's chest tightened, but she nodded, stepping away, even though every part of her wanted to stay. As she walked back inside, she heard Ethan exhale heavily behind her, as if he was fighting something within himself. And maybe so was she. A morning of unfinished business. The next morning, Emma woke up with a dull ache in her chest. Last night had changed something between them. They were dangerously close to crossing a line. And the worst part, she wanted to. But before she could dwell on it any longer, a sharp knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Ethan. He stood at the doorway, dressed impeccably in a dark suit, his expression composed, too composed. It was as if nothing had happened the night before. Emma's stomach twisted. So, this is how it was going to be. Back to business. Back to pretending. She forced herself to meet his gaze. Good morning. Ethan nodded. We have a meeting. Emma frowned. A meeting, he exhaled, stepping inside. The press is asking questions. People are suspicious. We need to appear stronger, more united. Emma swallowed hard. Right, they weren't real. Their marriage was a strategic move. Last night had meant nothing. She forced a smile, ignoring the ache in her chest. Got it. Let's put on a show. Ethan's gaze flickered with something unreadable, but he didn't say anything. Instead, he held out his arm. Shall we? Emma hesitated, for only a second before slipping her hand into his. And just like that, they became the perfect illusion again. The interview that changed everything. The press conference was held in a grand hotel, cameras flashing the moment they arrived. Ethan was the perfect billionaire husband, calm, confident, untouchable. Emma was the perfect wife, graceful, smiling, beautiful. They sat side by side, their hands intertwined for the cameras, answering questions with carefully crafted responses. It was all going smoothly, until someone asked the wrong question. Ethan, people are saying this marriage was rushed, that it isn't real. What do you have to say to that? The room fell silent. Emma stiffened slightly, glancing at Ethan. For a moment she thought he would deflect, brush it off like he always did. But then he did something completely unexpected. He turned to her, and in front of the flashing cameras, In front of the world, he cupped her face and kissed her. Emma's breath caught as warmth flooded her chest. It wasn't just for the cameras. This kiss was different. It was slow, deep, lingering, as if he was trying to tell her something words never could. When he pulled away, his gaze locked onto hers, unreadable, dark, intense. And then he smirked slightly, turning back to the reporter. "Does that answer your question?" The room exploded with noise, but Emma couldn't hear anything, because all she could think about was the way he had kissed her, and the terrifying realization that it didn't feel fake, not at all. The aftermath of a kiss that meant too much, the moment they stepped into the car, after the press conference, the air between them crackled with tension. Emma's heart was still racing, her lips tingling from the unexpected kiss. She stole a glance at Ethan. His expression was unreadable, his hands resting loosely on his lap, as if what had just happened wasn't turning her world upside down. She swallowed hard. That kiss. Ethan's gaze flickered to hers, dark and intense. What about it? Emma clenched her hands together, struggling to find the right words. It didn't feel fake. A muscle in Ethan's jaw ticked. He looked away, exhaling sharply. It was for the cameras. Emma felt something inside her crack. Of course her chest tightened, and she forced a bitter smile. Right, just a show. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead he reached for the whiskey bottle near the minibar, in the car, pouring himself a drink. He took a slow sip before speaking. It had to look real. His voice was measured, controlled, but something about the way his grip tightened around the glass told her it wasn't that simple. Emma bit her lip, looking out the window. Why did it hurt? She had agreed to this. She had known what this was. But last night, the way he had touched her, the way his lips had lingered on hers today, it wasn't just for the cameras. It couldn't be. Could it? A night of suppressed feelings. When they returned to the penthouse, Ethan disappeared into his study, leaving Emma alone in the grand living room. She felt restless, frustrated, confused. Her heart and mind were at war. She knew what this arrangement was supposed to be: a contract, a business deal, a performance for the world. But every time Ethan touched her, every time his gaze lingered too long, every time he let his guard down, even for a second, it felt real, and she was starting to crave it. With a heavy sigh, she walked toward the glass windows, staring out at the city lights. She didn't hear him come in, but she felt him. His presence behind her was undeniable, his warmth impossibly close. Emma, she turned slowly, her breath catching at the sight of him. He had undone the top few buttons of his shirt, his sleeves rolled up, his expression shadowed. He looked tired, torn, but his eyes, they were searching hers. Emma swallowed hard. What is it? Ethan hesitated, for a brief moment, and then he reached for her. His fingers grazed her arm, trailing upward, until they rested just below her shoulder. His touch sent fire through her veins. That kiss, it wasn't supposed to feel like that. His voice was low, rough, full of something dangerous. Emma's heart pounded. Then why did it? Ethan exhaled sharply, his grip tightening, ever so slightly. I don't know. Silence stretched between them, heavy and full of things neither of them could say. And then Ethan did something reckless. He pulled her closer. Emma's breath hitched as she found herself pressed against his chest, his heartbeat thudding beneath her palms. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, his lips inches from hers. Emma's pulse roared in her ears. She should tell him to stop. She should remind him this was fake. But when she opened her mouth, the words never came. Instead, she rose on her toes, closing the distance between them. And when their lips met, there was no camera, no audience, no lies. There was only them, a passion neither of them can control. This kiss was nothing like the one before. It wasn't careful, it wasn't planned. It was raw, desperate, consuming. Ethan's hands tangled in her hair, pulling her impossibly close, as his lips moved against hers. It was fire and danger, and everything she knew she shouldn't want, but did. Emma's fingers curled into his shirt,
her body pressed against his, as the world outside them blurred into nothing. When Ethan finally pulled away, his breathing was ragged, his forehead resting against hers. "What are we doing?" he murmured. Emma's chest rose and fell rapidly. "I don't know." Ethan's grip on her waist tightened, as if he was trying to hold himself back. "This was never supposed to happen." His voice was hoarse. Emma swallowed hard, forcing herself to take a step back. Her body screamed in protest, but she knew, if she stayed any closer, she'd be lost. She wrapped her arms around herself, looking up at him. "Then tell me the truth, Ethan." His jaw clenched. "The truth?" She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "You want me?" Ethan's eyes darkened, his gaze dropping to her lips before flicking back up. His entire body tensed, as if he was at war with himself, and then he turned away. "Good night, Emma." Emma felt her heart drop, and as she watched him walk away, she realized something terrifying. She wanted him to stay, but she also knew Ethan Hayes wasn't a man who let himself love, and if she wasn't careful, she would be the one left broken. A love that refuses to stay buried sleep never came for Emma. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart still racing from the kiss. From him, Ethan had walked away. Again, but this time, something was different. This time, she had seen the war in his eyes, the way he had looked at her before forcing himself to leave. He wanted her, she knew it, so why was he fighting it? She rolled onto her side, frustration and heartache warring inside her. How could a man who kissed like that pretend it meant nothing? Emma's mind spun with possibilities, but one thought stood out above all others. What if Ethan was just as scared as she was? The distance he tries to keep. The next morning, Emma found Ethan in the dining room, sitting at the grand table with a newspaper in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. His expression was unreadable, distant, composed, as if last night hadn't happened. Emma's stomach twisted. She had barely taken a step inside when Ethan spoke. "We have a charity event tonight." His voice was cool, formal. "I expect you to be ready by 7. Emma clenched her fists. So that was how he was going to play this. Like nothing had changed. Fine. Two could play that game. She forced a smile, taking a seat across from him. "Of course, darling." Ethan's eyes flicked up at the word, just for a second, but then he looked away, setting his cup down with deliberate care. He was pretending. But Emma, she was done pretending. She reached for the croissant on her plate, her movements slow, intentional. "You know, last night got me thinking." Ethan turned a page of the newspaper.
Did it?
Emma hummed, breaking off a piece of pastry. About us, about how real that kiss felt. Ethan stiffened. She caught it, the subtle clench of his jaw, the flicker of something dark in his eyes. Emma smiled. "Gotcha." Ethan exhaled, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. His gaze locked onto hers, sharp and dangerous. "It was a mistake." Emma arched a brow. "Was it?" His fingers curled around the edge of the table.
Yes.
She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Then why are you looking at me like that?" Ethan's breathing slowed, his jaw tightening. Emma could feel it, the tension crackling between them, thick, intoxicating, undeniable. But before he could respond, his phone buzzed. Ethan exhaled sharply, glancing at the screen, saved by the bell. Without another word, he stood up, adjusting his suit jacket. "Be ready by 7. And just like that, he was gone. Emma watched him walk away, her heart pounding. She had never been more sure of it. Ethan Hayes wanted her, and no matter how hard he tried to fight it, he was losing. The night that changes everything. The charity gala was a spectacle of luxury. Crystal chandeliers bathed the ballroom in golden light, champagne flowed endlessly, and every socialite in the city had gathered to see the newlywed couple. Emma walked beside Ethan, her hand resting in the crook of his arm. To the outside world, they were the perfect match, but inside they were a storm waiting to break. Emma could feel the heat radiating from Ethan, the tension in his muscles whenever she touched him. It was delicious, maddening, and she was done pretending she didn't feel it too. As they greeted guests, Ethan remained composed, distant, but when Emma leaned into him, whispering soft nothings into his ear for the cameras, he tensed. And when she pressed a hand to his chest, smiling up at him, as if he was the center of her world, his grip on her waist tightened. He was breaking, and she was loving every second of it. A dance too intimate. The orchestra began to play, signaling the first dance. Ethan turned to her, offering his hand. "Shall we?" Emma took it, letting him pull her onto the dance floor. The moment his hands found her waist, a shiver ran down her spine. He held her close, too close. Emma's breath caught as they moved together, their bodies in perfect sync. "You're playing a dangerous game," Ethan murmured against her ear. Emma smiled, tilting her head up. "So are you." His fingers tightened on her waist. "Emma." She looked up at him, her heart pounding. "Tell me you don't feel this," she whispered. Ethan's jaw clenched, and then he snapped. In one swift motion, he led her off the dance floor, his grip firm as he guided her through the grand halls of the venue. Emma's breath hitched as he pushed open a door, pulling her into a dimly lit private lounge. The door shut behind them. Silence. Thick, heavy, electric. And then Ethan was on her. His hands cupped her face, his lips crashing into hers, with a hunger that stole her breath. Emma gasped, her fingers tangling in his hair. As she melted into him, their bodies pressed flush against each other. It was reckless. It was dangerous. But it was real. And this time, neither of them pulled away. The moment of no return. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless, shaken. Ethan's forehead rested against hers, his hands still cradling her face. His voice was hoarse. "I can't." Emma's fingers pressed against his lips, silencing him.
Oh.
"Don't say it." He swallowed hard, his hands trailing down her arms. "This wasn't supposed to happen." Emma let out a shaky laugh. "Then why does it feel like it was always meant to?" Ethan didn't answer, because he knew there was no going back. Not after this. A morning of unspoken words. The golden rays of the morning sun filtered through the sheer curtains, casting a warm glow over the vast bedroom. The air was thick with the remnants of last night's passion, confusion and unspoken truce. Emma lay awake, her heart still racing, remembering Ethan's touch, his lips on hers, the way he had given in, if only for a moment. But now the other side of the bed was cold, empty. A sinking feeling settled in her chest. He was gone. She sat up slowly, wrapping the silk sheets around herself, scanning the room. His suit jacket was no longer draped over the chair, his watch missing from the nightstand. Ethan Hayes had disappeared, before the sun had even risen. Emma closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. What did I expect? That he'd wake up next to her. That he'd finally admit this was more than just a game. That he'd stop running. A bitter smile tugged at her lips. She should have known better. Ethan Hayes didn't do emotions. And yet, last night in the privacy of that darkened lounge, he had kissed her like he'd been starving for. She had seen the war in his eyes. He wanted her, but wanting her and accepting it were two very different things. And Ethan, he was still fighting. The walls he refuses to let down. By the time Emma entered the dining room, Ethan was already there, a picture of cold, unreadable perfection. He sat at the head of the table, dressed in a crisp black suit, sipping his coffee, like nothing had changed, like last night hadn't happened. Emma clenched her jaw. So this is how it was going to be. She took a seat across from him, her fingers curling around her fork as she stabbed at her breakfast. Silence stretched between them, thick, suffocating. Finally Ethan spoke. "You're quiet this morning." Emma let out a dry laugh. "So are you." He didn't look at her, didn't dare. Instead he flipped through the morning newspaper, his expression carefully neutral. Emma set down her fork. "Enough, are we just going to pretend last night didn't happen?" Ethan stiffened, but then without missing a beat, he calmly folded the newspaper and set it aside. His dark eyes met hers, void of emotion. It was a mistake. Emma felt her heart shatter, even though she had expected those words. She forced a smirk. Oh, you seemed pretty invested in that mistake. Ethan's jaw clenched. But before he could respond, she leaned forward, her voice softer. Tell me, Ethan, when you kissed me last night, was that fake too? For the first time, she saw him falter. It was quick, barely a flicker of hesitation in his gaze, but it was there. And that was all the confirmation Emma needed. She shook her head, pushing back her chair. I thought so. Then she stood and walked away, leaving Ethan staring after her, his grip on his coffee cup so tight, it nearly shattered. A night that changes everything. Again, Ethan had avoided her all day. Emma didn't know why she felt so angry, so restless, so hurt. It was just a contract, wasn't it? It was supposed to be fake. But now she wasn't sure where the lies ended, and the truth began. And neither, it seemed, was Ethan. That night, Emma was in the library, curled up in an armchair, flipping through a book she wasn't really reading, when the door suddenly swung open. She gasped, looking up, only to find Ethan. His tie was loosened, his hair slightly disheveled, his eyes dark with something dangerous. Her breath caught. Ethan, I can't do this. His voice was rough, hoarse. Emma's heart pounded. Do what? He took a step closer. Pretend. Her pulse roared in her ears. Then don't. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. Emma, I. But before he could finish, she rose from her chair and closed the distance between them. Then stop fighting it, Ethan. She looked up at him, her voice trembling. Because I'm not going to wait for you to decide if I'm worth the risk. His eyes flickered with something raw, something desperate. And then he snapped. 1 second, there was distance between them. The next, Ethan had her against the wall, his hands on her waist, his lips crashing into hers, like he was drowning. Emma gasped against his mouth, her arms wrapping around his neck as she kissed him back with just as much fire. It wasn't soft, it wasn't careful, it was everything they had been denying, everything they had been too afraid to say. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. Ethan swallowed hard, his grip tightening on her waist. This wasn't supposed to happen. Emma smiled softly, brushing a hand through his hair. Then stop acting like it's a mistake. Ethan didn't answer, because deep down, he knew she was right, and for the first time in his life, he didn't want to fight anymore.
To breaking point, the night was heavy with tension. Ethan and Emma stood in the dimly lit library, their bodies close, breaths mingling, the echoes of their last kiss still lingering in the air. Emma searched his eyes, waiting, hoping he would finally stop running, hoping he would stop pretending. But Ethan was silent, his fingers flexed on her waist, like he wanted to pull her closer, but was too afraid to. Emma exhaled a shaky breath. Say something, Ethan, his jaw clenched. I can't give you what you want, Emma. Her heart ached, but she held her ground. And what do I want? He closed his eyes for a brief moment, exhaling harshly. Something real. She swallowed, the pain sharp in her chest. And you can't give me that? Ethan hesitated, and that was her answer. Emma felt the tears sting her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She nodded slowly, stepping back. I see. Ethan reached for her, instinctively, desperately, but stopped himself. Emma, no. Her voice trembled, but her resolve didn't. I'm not going to be another one of your regrets, Ethan. Silence. She turned away, walking towards the door, every step a painful goodbye. And then, his voice stopped her. I love you. Emma froze, her heart slammed against her ribs as she turned back, disbelief in her eyes. Ethan looked tormented, raw, vulnerable, utterly stripped bare, his hands clenched at his sides, his breathing uneven. I love you, Emma. I have for a long time, and it terrifies me. Tears slipped down Emma's cheeks. Then why are you pushing me away? Ethan exhaled, stepping closer, his voice thick with emotion. Because I don't know how to love someone without losing them. The pain in his voice shattered her. She reached for his hand, gripping it tight. You're not going to lose me, Ethan. Not unless you let me go. He looked down at their hands, and for the first time, he didn't pull away. The choice Ethan had spent his whole life guarding his heart, keeping love at a distance, because he had seen what it could do. But Emma, she had torn down every wall. She had walked into his life and made him feel things he had sworn he never would. And now, he had a choice. To keep running, or to finally take the leap. Ethan lifted a hand, cupping her cheek. I don't want to let you go. Emma's breath caught. Then don't. And just like that, he chose her. He kissed her, not with hesitation, not with restraint, but with everything he had been too afraid to say. Emma melted into him, her arms wrapping around his neck, holding on to him like he was the only thing keeping her grounded. Because in that moment, he was. The forever they never expected 1 month ago. Their marriage had been nothing but a contract. Now, it was everything. The next morning, Ethan took Emma's hand and led her to his private garden, where roses bloomed under the golden sunlight. She looked at him, confused. Why are we here? Ethan pulled a velvet box from his pocket, flipping it open. Inside was a ring, real this time. Emma gasped. Ethan knelt before her, his eyes softer than she had ever seen them. Emma, I never thought I'd find someone like you. Someone who could love me, despite my flaws, despite my fears. I don't deserve you, but I'm done pushing you away. Tears welled in Emma's eyes. Ethan swallowed hard. This marriage started as a contract, but I want to make it real. I want to spend my life with you, not because I have to, but because I want to. A tear slipped down her cheek. Ethan, marry me again, Emma. This time, for real. She let out a shaky laugh, her heart swelling. Yes, Ethan. 1,000 times, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, kissing her with all the love he had been too afraid to show. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Hayes wasn't afraid anymore.